Hey everybody, it's Norm from Tested.
And it's Jeremy from Tested.
Welcome to Projections, our show about virtual reality and augmented reality, which we see popping up in a lot of places. You went to recently an event called Day of the Devs.
Yeah, they've been having this event here in San Francisco for 5 years now. It's run by Double Fine, Tim Schafer's company. And every year they bring in all these indies, games you've never heard of, or games maybe you have like Cuphead. And they always have a couple VR titles. And this year there was a unveiling. This is the first time that ever been shown as a game by a local group called The Rig, and it is a sci-fi based kind of story game.
Yeah, you were pretty excited after playing the demo, a 15-20 minute demo, interactive story-based experience.
Kind of a room where you have to puzzle solve, good effects, good graphics, but it's a very small team. And I'm amazed that you can do VR, like a quality VR game with a small team. This is a 4-person team. It's not even their full-time job.
Nights and weekends.
Exactly.
Well, they are local, so what we did was invited the developers of The Rig over to our office for a chat about what it's like to make a game, an indie VR game, and the lessons they've learned from working on it.
So Abe and Chris, you're joining us from Sunset Division.
That's right.
And you just revealed The Rig, your new VR game, at Day of the Devs.
Yeah,
this past weekend. Yeah?
Right, and you were there.
I was. Yeah.
Can't stop talking about it.
I think I was the first person to play it.
You were, which was great. We had no idea how many people were going to come or anything. It was crazy.
So what fascinated me was that you guys are a San Francisco-based independent VR game developer, which is almost unheard of. I mean, to be in the Bay Area is one thing, but you're here in San Francisco, so we had to invite you guys in here ASAP to have a chat.
We're really happy to be here.
Yeah, this is great.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the game, The Rig, just to get us started?
Sure. The Rig is a virtual reality game set in space. It's a science fiction noir adventure, kind of in the style of a point-and-click adventure from the old days, but obviously no click, more just reach out and grab and really solve puzzles and talk to people and go on a little mystery adventure story.
Sounds right at home for Tim Schafer, like
right? Yeah,
at Double Fine. Seems like right
yeah,
at his alley.
I think that's how we got in there.
Yeah, I think we were all inspired by games that he made and games like that. So like Grim Fandango is one that we've talked about
it's
a lot.
One of my favorites. Yep.
What about VR titles? What VR titles have you seen over the past? I mean, I assume you've been following VR as closely as we have.
Certainly.
What games have inspired you over the past couple of years?
Yeah, on a variety of platforms, I think. So we all have Vives, and so we've all been playing a bunch of those games. I don't know which ones you're playing most recently.
Oh boy, I mean, I played, actually I played the Kitten Apocalypse recently, which, and that kind of little thing where you just knock things around or whatever, like, I feel like that's half the games out there, right, for VR right now, but it's really fun. I'm really looking forward to the Fallout game that's coming out.
Sure. The Fallout VR conversion.
Fallout VR, yeah.
I think one that I've been playing a lot is Space Pirate Trainer. It's basically a classic by now, I guess.
I call it the Galaxian of VR. Yeah.
And then actually, I've got a Daydream with a Pixel, and virtual reality is a really interesting game, I think, on the Daydream. So.
Now, for The Rig, did you guys start out with a story, or did you guys start out saying you wanted to make a VR game because you were fans of VR?
Yeah, I think it's a little more, we started with a story because this was actually something we were sort of percolating years ago.
It's about 3 years ago.
3 years ago we were talking about making a game, and back then none of us had Vives, and so we were like, oh, is this going to be like just a little like side-scroller adventure game or something very simple in 2D. And then I think a friend of ours, Matt, who is on the team, brought a Vive over one day about 1.5 years ago. And we had a few little assets lying around from what we had done years before. And we put them in we put the spaceship in the Vive, and took like 15 minutes to do in Unity. And next thing we know, we were like, oh my God, like this is crazy, this is amazing. We have to just keep going with this. And
yeah, that was right after the Vive came out. He got an early one, yeah.
So what about the game did you find worked in VR and what didn't?
Pretty much nothing worked in VR that was was the original idea. I mean, there was a while where it wasn't even a 3D game.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the interesting thing that I'm finding is that people really in VR, and what we learned on Day of the Devs is that people just want to like grab things and like play around with them. And so traditional linear narrative gaming is not quite the same, because people really don't want to pay attention to that unless you really force them to. They want to just like knock things around and play with cards.
Most of the demo takes place in one room, a spaceship essentially. And I feel like in VR you can make something that's deep and narrow. You know, as long you can do one room, but you have to go deep, right?
Yeah.
Because not only can you lean close to things, and you need all that texture resolution, but people want to touch everything, like you're saying, right?
Yeah, they want to pick things up. I mean, Abe is a master of like building that content, that narrative, and has done a good job of sort of filling in the world with story, background.
But what we're finding that's so hard is that, you know, the story, you really have to punch people in the face with every little detail. You have to say things way more than I think you would in a traditional 3D game, because people are so overwhelmed as they look around. And I think that's obviously going to change as VR continues and more people actually have a Vive or an Oculus or whatever. They'll get used to it and it becomes just, you know, day to day or whatever. But still, right now, especially like when people came to Day of the Devs who have never played it, they just, you know, you really have to just like keep slapping them with like what's going on in the story.
There's certainly still a lot of novelty there, yeah.
Yeah, I think you saw that also, you know, going from 2D to just first person, like in 2D, the classic adventure games, any change in the graphic of the sprite, you would notice, easy to direct your eyes to a cue. And then first person, you're immersed, and then VR, you're even more immersed.
Yep.
So what type of interactions are you programming into the game? What type of, like, as you go through the story, what are the type of puzzles that you'll be solving or tackling?
Yeah, well, so there's puzzles, there's also dialogue, which is something that we didn't see a lot in VR games when we were looking around when we were early on in this process. And that was actually an interesting thing that we had to figure out. The puzzles are sort of traditional adventure game puzzles. You're combining things, you're finding something that's useful in another situation. And maybe like slightly different than what you would expect it to normally be used for. And actually that's what we saw at Day of the Devs, when really the first 20 people or so that really played it outside of our close circle have tried it. People were just throwing things around and doing what you are normally asked to do in an adventure game, but very naturally, right? They're combining objects in different ways that we didn't expect. And of course we want to support those kinds of things. We want to encourage people to be creative and play the way they want to.
It seems like all of the things that you could touch in the game were purposely colored orange. Do you think that that's specific to VR, that you need that kind of a cue?
Yeah, that's what we're finding, because some of the earlier versions of the game and the environments in the game were actually more detailed, a lot more detailed. We had a lot more buttons and just like fun little like widgets and stuff playing. And we didn't necessarily want people to actually touch those. They were just environment and atmosphere. But you know what we found was that like the slightest little light somewhere, someone's going to go up and start hitting it, and so we had to pare that down more and more and more and more until the ship has become kind of just this like very low poly, almost low detail, more artistic kind of presentation, we want to call attention to the few things that do actually have a function, so that people don't spend 3 hours just mucking around.
Is that because it was difficult to program all the simulations and all the things you could actually do?
No, I think, and actually we want to get there in the game where you will be able to do all the little things most people would be able to play with and think about, but we don't want them to think that every little thing is something that has a purpose. I mean, if this table had like a little pattern on it just for fun, like it doesn't mean you want to actually like grab that pattern and move it around or whatever. Like
there's a bit of scope creep there, right, as well. Like we want to limit the amount of time it takes to get this out the door. Yeah,
right,
for sure.
Well, that brings up the interesting question of like, yes, when are you going to get it out the door, and what's that pressure like? Because VR is a niche, market right now. It still is, even though it's constantly ramping up. And with the holidays ahead of us, we hope that's going to increase a lot more.
Yep.
But do you feel a particular pressure because the market is somewhat narrow in order to ship within scope and on time?
Well, I think we definitely want to get it out the door before too long. Before there's maybe other games like it out there. But I think we're doing this to make sure that we build a good game, and so we're focused on like making sure that it's a quality game that we put out. So next year is what we're targeting right now.
Cool.
Abe, you mentioned story, noir, adventure game as the descriptors of the game, and one of the things I noticed in the demo is that you have voiceover in the player's head, and you're also, it looked like there were flashbacks. In VR, you know, flashbacks are, you can't jump cut and you can't edit a story. So how are you guys telling things in the past? Or telling a story, and having the person interact with that story.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of a debate that has been back and forth. You know, we finally decided, yeah, we do want to be able to hear the character, unlike, you know, maybe a Half-Life game or something like that, because we do have a story that we think is important and we want to tell it. But I actually think if you think of it, you know, in a more cinematic way, you can get some of those things in there. We do, you know, we can sort of have people flash back as long as you are really clear about what's happening at any given. If someone is flashing back, you want to say this is a flashback. You don't want to leave it as subtle as maybe you would otherwise.
You also have a visual way of transporting the player, at least from the intro scene to the spaceship, right? It's kind of a Star Wars.
Yeah, and we've got a narrative kind of context for it where, like, if you're in warp space, you kind of have daydreams, and there's a reason that you're going back and forth in your head. And
You've been on the ship for 9 weeks. Like, you're going to be daydreaming there. You're going to be not necessarily present on the ship all the time, right?
Interesting.
And these are things you're forcing onto the player as part of the story, which and they have to kind of understand that you know, they themselves aren't going crazy. It's part of the character they're inhabiting.
Exactly.
What about character interactions? Like there are NPCs that you'll be chatting with. I know there's a ship computer that you chat with. You talked about experimenting with dialogue choices. Some games I've seen have, you know, wrist-controlled dialogue choices. Some have gaze-controlled dialogue choices. You guys experiment with how do you get a player, me and Jeremy, to feel like we're actually making choices, saying the lines. You try even voice control at some point?
We haven't really tried voice control. We talked about it a bit early on. I think we wanted something that felt natural and would work 100% of the time. And I guess one of the considerations we had was not necessarily having to use your hand. That felt unnatural to like choose a dialogue choice by reaching out. And we do, like, watching people play it, sometimes people do that, but what we wanted was something very natural, and just like moving your head around was the most natural thing.
And also just narratively, it kind of makes sense to imagine that people are like trying to decide in their head, what am I going to say? And so, you know, having them look around and decide that felt, I think, really good. And when we started working on it, there wasn't really much of that out there. When it was just like some of the most games didn't even have, you know, narrative or dialogue like a year and a half ago or whatever. And so it was an interesting process. We definitely thought about, like you said, like having people just say the line themselves, but it made it more difficult to tell the story that we wanted to tell that way.
And you're relying on technology, like voice recognition technology.
We'd be relying on other people's algorithms.
Right. Or people playing in an hour where they can speak. Like sometimes they're playing in a room where they have to be quiet.
Sure,
That's true. It's funny, it's just interesting to hear you talk about how you have to balance the user interface with psychological elements, like not just what's intuitive, but what makes sense narratively. I think that's interesting. I noticed that the teleportation effect has been built into the narrative. For instance, like in a lot of games, teleportation, you know, there's different sides of the fence people fall on, whether or not that's a great way to move around the world. But when it's done well, I feel like it's built into the narrative.
Yeah, and it makes sense in our game because it's a science fiction game. It's like 100 years in the future. So maybe there would be teleportation. Who knows, you know? So like, I'm actually kind of glad that it kind of worked out that way, because if it was like the Old West or something, then you have to decide, you know, to basically ignore the fact that that is happening in the story and for the character, and just assume that it's, you know, a conceit of moving really fast, or, you know, time jumping forward or something like that. But we lucked out, I think, in that way.
How expansive are you hoping the game to be? We saw the one interior of the ship, so obviously the last stuff outside the ship, but how many different environments, or how immersed is a person supposed to get into?
So ultimately, like the story takes you to the space station. That's what the rig is. It's a mining rig, like an asteroid mining rig. We do have story to tell there. This version of the game that we have right now that we're building is kind of like leading you into that, and that's what we want to ship right now. We want it because we want to get that out and see what people are interested. You will in this game get to the space station and get to see a little bit of that. But right now it's sort of like more of a novella kind of compact story little experience.
And we're calling it Chapter 1, right? So if Chapter 1 goes well, we'll get into Chapter 2.
Right. Yes, episodic gaming.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, bringing it back.
Right. So can we just talk for a minute just generically about VR development? Something we haven't had a chance to do too much on this show, but like, can you bring us up to speed? When VR development was first, out and people were first experimenting with it, it seemed like there were some compromises that had to be made, whether it was like shadows or the way things were rendered. Certainly you still have to hit a high frame rate, but do you feel like the tools are up to what you guys want to do?
I think so.
I think they are now. Yeah, I mean, we're using Unity, which is not to like advertise for them, but like it's got a lot of plugins right out of the box, and Valve, has the VRTK toolkit that's kind of just ready to go. We've taken that and we've modified it for what we need, but just being able to kind of plug things right in has been really great, and then just take it from there.
How big is your team?
It's 4 of us. Yeah.
So 3 developers, and Abe is more of the artist and animator.
And you did the modeling as well?
Yeah. Yeah, but it's, I mean, they've made it pretty easy for us now. I don't know what it would have been like 2 years ago if we had gotten the early, Oculus dev kit or something like that.
Have you become very adept at modeling on the computer screen and knowing what it will look and feel like? Or is there a lot of this?
There is a lot of that still, yeah. Maybe less so now, but certainly early on that blew my mind a little bit. Like, in a traditional game, you might have, for example, what happened to us is we realized the toilet was just enormous when we got into the VR.
Right.
And it looks good if this was just a first-person shooter or something. It's like you want things to stand out and feel like artistically designed, so you make things certain sizes that way. But in VR, it has to be like real world specific, which was crazy to me.
I feel like when you model, you typically model based off of just like your, I don't know, your guesses.
Sensibilities.
Right?
Yeah. I was modeling based on what felt good, to me visually. I come from like a filmmaking background and an animation background. And in animation, you might want, a house to be much larger than a regular house, or a chair to be, depending on what you're going for aesthetically, it could be all kinds of things because you're being creative.
And we're still adjusting this as we go and as we see people play it. So right now, like I think some of the buttons on sort of on counters and stuff are maybe a little bit too far, and people have to reach too far. So there's still adjustments there. We're still learning.
Which you wouldn't expect because otherwise you would just be pressing spacebar or whatever, and you wouldn't have to worry about that kind of thing.
Right.
But now you actually have to reach and.
How much of it are you developing in VR, or is it all going from 2D?
You mean like actually in VR?
In VR.
This is one of the things that I think the tools could be better at. So right now we've done a decent job of creating what we call like a development environment or a debugging environment where you don't necessarily have to have the VR headset available because you don't always have that available, right? But it's a lot more limited in what you can do and really what you can try out and make sure it looks right and feels right. So a lot of the development work we've done has been as a group, with at least one headset available, if not 2, and then other people kind of like working alongside and people throwing it in, someone jumping in, someone jumping out.
Do you do any, I don't even know if Unity supports it to the extent that Unreal does, but where you can actually mold the world and place objects in the VR space?
Oh yeah.
Are you doing that?
We do that, yeah. We change the size of things, we throw things in, we'll change animations and whatnot while people are in there. It can be a little bit mind-bending to see things in your world changing size as you're just like holding them or something.
We might even move the person around to set the stage for where they're going to start, and then you kind of feel like some god omniscient being is like pushing you around. It's very bizarre. Right. People get easily sick, but
that was something that we learned early on. Is it's really easy to make people nauseous in VR, and we had to scale back our initial ambitions of letting you. There's an opportunity to turn off gravity in the game and float around a bit, and so we realized that the most natural way of doing that is actually very upsetting to people's stomachs. So
you mean like the most physically accurate way to do
exactly.
that?
Right. So that was our first approach, and it's like, nope. After about 5 seconds, you're just like, no, I have to
and
sit down.
And it's not disorienting in a fun way, which I thought it might be. You know, like, oh, like this is what it would be like to be an astronaut or something, but it's not fun. It's
yeah. So we had probably like 4 different passes of like restricting the movement of of what you can do in no gravity, until we got to a point where we realized, okay, this is actually something that people can deal with and will not be a problem. But it still feels real, and it feels like you still suspend disbelief.
Yeah.
It's just it's not what we originally imagined. Yeah.
Motion sickness is the elephant in the room for every VR developer, it seems, and everyone's learned since the DK1 what can and can't be done. But some people have embraced different settings, like for the more adventurous. Are you guys thinking about that, or is there any need to with your game to unlock, more potentially nauseating experiences?
That's a good question. I mean, we do have things like you're getting down on the ground at some points, and like lying on your back to do reaching up, and there are various things where you're actually not just standing the whole time and reaching out. Mm-hmm. So we do have things like that. I think part of what we haven't really thought about allowing people to choose their level of nausea
intensity.
Intensity, yeah.
That is interesting, though.
Yeah, I think some of the challenges that we've identified is like people of different heights can and can't do certain things, and there are different ways to address that. Right. But that's a challenge, right? That's something where you need a solution for that, so a kid can play, and also someone that's quite tall.
I have a 10-year-old who plays super hot,
yeah.
And there's those cutscenes where you have to put the helmet on, right?
Yeah.
And he can't reach it. So he literally jumps 3 times before he finally gets it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Before we demoed it for you guys on Saturday, one of the last second changes was to pull one of the levers in the ship way further down than we originally had it, because we knew there were kids coming, and there will be kids maybe playing, so.
Yeah. A lot of your developers we talk to, as they're making their game over a year, 2 years' time, they fill up a notebook of other ideas that they learn, or like just making games sparks new ideas that you're not going to fit in this game. You have a scope that you want to fit to. Is it the same for you guys? Or
yeah, every time we get together and work on this, we go have like dinner, get tacos. And the conversation is typically, all right, guys, we're just going to throw this game away, and we've got this other idea now that we're going to tackle.
It's way better. Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, we've got a bunch of ideas for sure. I think my favorite one I'll just throw out there is like Pipe Dream, but in VR. And you've got to like place the pipes, and you're in a room, and it's a constrained space, and like the water's filling up, and you're fighting to make sure that you don't drown.
Oh, so it's like real world, you're going to drown.
Yeah, you're placing the pipes to make sure the water stops filling up the room.
That sounds terrifying.
Exactly. but we
can take all those old games like what is it? Keeper?
Minesweeper.
Minesweeper.
Yeah. Like a lot of these just haven't been done, those kinds of interactions. And I think that's the fascinating part of VR. It's like you're reimagining, or it's sort of a green field, right? Like what is fun, and what can be done, and what hasn't been done yet. And I think there's a lot. So
we also have to fight against those ideas taking over and being like, hey, let's put that in the game, and add another 6 months to the development process, because there's so many amazing possibilities there.
One thing that we did do is add in this sort of like ability to pour liquids around. So we had cups, and we had you're sort of this like deadbeat guy who drinks a bit, and so we had to have some kind of ability to drink and maybe even get drunk in the game.
That may or may not come into play as a puzzle.
Yeah, it may or may not be part of the gameplay. But so part of that was like, now we have to build this system of being able to pour liquids around, and like being able to fill a cup. And that actually was a nice tangent that took a while to really build, because again, like the dev tools are there, but not everything is there yet.
Cool. What we found that was also very interesting is that when people pick up a cup in a game, for some reason they don't necessarily drink it the way you would in real life. They kind of just like pour it over their head. So we had to account for that.
Yeah. Instead of doing this, people will do this.
Right. Yeah. They forget that you have to be careful with water, and so like people were spilling the water before it even got to their mouth, and then they realized, oh yeah, you actually have to put it up, and so we had to.
I feel like that's Job Simulator figured that out, because everything is like Duplo, right? It's Duplo Lego. Everything's just gigantic.
Job Simulator did a really good job of figuring out a lot of those things very early on. It's a good place to look at, I think, for how to solve a lot of those problems.
Definitely good inspiration for those kinds of interactions, yeah.
Well, we're definitely looking forward to the rig. I love to catch you guys mid-development, so we'll see how it turns out.
Great.
Wish you guys the best of luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thanks for having us.
No problem. Thank you.
One more thing that we want to talk about today is a emulator.
Oh.
Yeah, we don't think of virtual reality in emulators very often, but there is a virtual reality console that came out long before the Rift. You were probably a baby when this came out, Norman. This is the Virtual Boy.
Virtual Boy, I saw this, we're seeing this at Blockbusters.
Really?
Yeah.
That's amazing. No, I actually bought one. Like, I was one of the crazy sods that got up and went to Kmart and got my Virtual Boy as soon as it came out.
And was disappointed.
Just like everybody else. So this, I mean, I'm sure most of our viewers know, but it was a Nintendo console that was basically a headset, had no motion tracking.
No.
So you put your head up to it. It actually came with a stand because it was not light. And you put your head up into it, and it's a red screen, stereo, so everything's in 3D. But everything's red, and Game Boy style sound, maybe a little bit better. Actually, it was a 32-bit processor. It came out in 1995.
Yeah.
Well, there is an emulator. So if you want to see what the early days of VR was like,
Stereo gaming.
before it was actually a product that should probably come to life, the emulator is VBJin, so VBJIN, and you can Google it and to your heart's content, take those old Virtual Boy ROMs and rip them down into your computer, and you can try them out in VR.
So how many games, what were the games that came out for Virtual Boy that you've been playing in your VR headset?
I think worldwide there were 22 that came out before the system completely died, but in the States, I think we got 14.
I remember Tetris very clearly.
There were actually 2 Tetris games. So like
What?
2 of those 22 games are Tetris. Like, there you go. That's the 90s for you. But the one that I played when I got the thing was Mario Tennis.
Yes.
Because it has Mario in the title.
Of course.
And, you know, the depth is there. You're on your side of the court, and I guess it's Wario or somebody on the other side. And it's an interesting console to like look at the limitations that they had back then. I think that they could do sprites and put them in different planes, so you could almost create like a Viewmaster style thing where it's just 2-dimensional objects that are placed in space. You could also do 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional sprites, but if you move those around, the orientation wouldn't look right. So they could use those sparingly.
What about vectors? Lines?
Occasionally you got vectors. And while Mario Tennis is fine, my favorite game that I played, and I had no idea this existed, is a game called Red Alarm. Now this is unique. I played through all of the games that I could find in the emulator, but this one was just different ballpark altogether. It was a vector game where you are a vector spaceship that is flying through these corridors, you know, with walls and ceilings and the whole thing, and everything's wireframe. Like, there's not a single texture in the entire game as far as I can tell. It's all wireframes, and it's got to run at 9 frames a second. But it's compelling because everything is actually 3D.
Now, is any of this experience, does any of it benefit from using a modern VR headset and modern computing, or is it still running at that limited field of view, limited frame rate?
I think the field of view, as I recall, is probably very similar. The default setting for this emulator is a locked to your head, you know, perspective. So
no head tracking.
There's no head tracking. And I feel as a purist that is the way you're supposed to play this. However, there is another mode called probably comfort mode or something. There's a video. It's the Oculus Rift setting, and you can change it to a head tracked mode. Now things get funky, it's beta at best, but you now have the projection of the game in 3D space, and
locked in.
Yeah, it's like in space locked in.
I love this.
And you can get up and walk around it, and you can look away from it.
It feels like then you're actually entering the world that the Virtual Boy game exists in.
It's like that, but the perspective can get very wrong.
That's cool though, you can see where the layers are.
Totally.
Where are those sprites?
And you can get deep into it so it feels more of your field of view.
Yeah.
Things can get too close. So it's definitely interesting to explore games from that perspective too. You can also, if red isn't your color, you prefer gray, there's a setting for that.
Okay.
And you can go into...
Just those 2 colors?
Oh, that's it. No, that's it.
Of course.
That's twice as many colors as the original console had.
All right.
There's other interesting games. There's a Wario game, which is a side-scroller. And you do that, but then of course, what do we do to make it 3D? Because everything's got a gimmick. Well, Wario can jump from platform in the distance to platform in the foreground.
Nice.
Back and forth if he finds these pads. I think you might even be able to jump like a third layer back. And he gets smaller, and so it's interesting to see them play with that. And it's, for me, constantly interesting to dissect how are they using technology. Like, where are the 2D sprites? Where is the actual 3D? Where are they using 3D sprites? There's a boxing game that's kind of interesting where it's almost like Punch-Out. It's like the virtual reality version of Punch-Out, 1995 style, where your hands are basically your player, and the opponent takes up most of the screen. And to see how they made 3D work with his face and the way that their angles are formed, and the controls for that are pretty interesting. I haven't figured them out yet, but I can tell there's some depth there. There were some interesting tries.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it was the hardware that I think failed with the Virtual Boy, because the locked perspective just caused nausea for some people.
And the expectations, the way they sold it. When you call it Virtual Boy, you're thinking Lawnmower Man, you're thinking entering an immersive world, and we didn't get that until just a couple years ago with consumer VR headsets. I know. I would love for an indie developer to make a game, the game that we thought we were going to get with Virtual Boy. Make it look like Virtual Boy, make it wireframe graphics, run at 90 frames per second, and put you in the red wireframe world using a Rift or Revive.
Yeah, the old 8-bit style is hugely popular in the indie scene, and it's on Steam everywhere. What is the virtual reality equivalent of that? Like, we've seen 8-bit style shooters where you get into a world that looks like Wolfenstein or something like that, but I love that idea of a first-person wireframe perspective. That has real potential.
And until then, you can still just download that Virtual Boy emulator for your VR headset. Maybe, I don't know if it's essential playing to appreciate the history of VR, but definitely interesting. All right, essential playing from Jeremy to appreciate VR, and an interesting look into the past as we continue looking to the future. I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. We'll be back next week with more VR talk. But until then, see ya.